Okay, so today we're diving headfirst into a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah.
The rise of some seriously powerful and violent criminal organizations.
Yeah,
And, we're talking about the ones that have really dug in deep in Honduras and Venezuela.
right.
Our listeners are pretty savvy when it comes to global issues.
Oh, for sure.
So I think they're going to be right there with us,
Yeah.
wanting to understand,
Yeah,
just how these gangs have managed to gain so much power and influence.
exactly.
So today we're focusing on two of the biggest players in this whole scene.
Okay.
We've got Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13,
Mm.
and over in Venezuela we've got this incredibly powerful and kind of terrifying group called Tren de Aragua.
Yeah.
We're going to really unpack their origins,
It's a fascinating story.
figure out how they operate with really shocking levels of impunity,
Yeah,
and delve into the consequences of their actions on a global scale.
exactly.
And I guarantee you, we're going to uncover some things that are going to make you stop and think. So let's start with Honduras.
Okay.
How did these incredibly dangerous gangs even get their start there?
Well, to really get a handle on it, we need to kind of rewind the clock a bit.
Okay.
Back to the 70s and 80s in Honduras.
Okay.
It was a period of intense social and political change, and, a lot of people were on the move,
Right.
which really set the stage for these criminal networks to start forming.
So the roots of the problem
Yeah, exactly.
go back that far.
Yeah, and here's the thing, some of the most notorious gangs we know today, like MS-13 and Barrio 18,
Right.
they actually started out as street gangs in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like a boomerang effect.
Right, it's a sort of a reverse export.
Right.
It started there and then came back.
Okay, so let's talk about MS-13.
Okay.
That name alone conjures up a lot of fear, and for good reason.
It does.
What's their story?
So, Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13 as we know them, they were formed by Salvadoran immigrants in L.A.
Right.
And they quickly became known for their extreme brutality. We're talking beheadings, mass killings, brutal initiations.
Oh, wow.
Their whole MO was to instill terror. And they were very effective at it.
Yeah, they definitely achieved that.
Yeah.
And what about Barrio 18?
Yeah.
They're always mentioned in the same breath as MS-13.
Right.
What's their deal?
So Barrio 18 also comes from the LA street scene.
Okay.
And they actually formed as rivals to MS-13.
Oh, so from the beginning.
Yeah, from the start.
Okay.
And then as gang members were deported back to Honduras,
Right.
Barrio 18 took root there too.
Yeah.
And got involved in all the usual stuff, drug trafficking, extortion, and of course they were constantly fighting with MS-13 for territory.
So you've got these two incredibly powerful forces establishing themselves in Honduras.
Right.
But what were the conditions in Honduras that allowed them not just to exist, but to actually thrive and become so dominant?
Right. Well, it was a perfect storm of factors, really.
Right.
First of all, you had widespread poverty,
Right.
very limited opportunities for a lot of young people. Right.
And so for many of them, joining a gang seemed like the only way to survive.
Yeah, you can see how it would be tempting.
Some income, a sense of belonging, especially in a society where there's not a lot of support from institutions.
Right.
It's, like if the government's not there for you, a gang offering even a little bit of money and some kind of community can seem pretty appealing, right?
It's the powerful point.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you had a government that was, well, let's just say, not exactly known for its effectiveness.
Right.
And there was a lot of corruption, which basically meant that gangs could operate pretty freely without much fear of consequences.
Yeah, it's like a breeding ground
Exactly.
for this kind of activity.
And then you add in Honduras's location.
Right.
It became a major transit point for cocaine coming from South America and headed to the U.S.
Right.
Which meant a huge influx of money for these gangs.
Right.
Giving them even more power.
Right. So it's like layer upon layer of...
Things that just make it easier for them.
And then there's the deportations from the U.S., which, as we mentioned, actually brought back a lot of gang members.
Right.
But it wasn't just the people, it was their knowledge of how to run these criminal operations, their networks.
Right, so it was like importing expertise.
Yeah, exactly, like a blueprint for organized crime.
Wow, so it's really a complex set of circumstances.
Very complex.
You mentioned the San Pedro Sula massacre in 2004 as a turning point.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what happened there and why it was so significant?
Oh, it was a horrific event.
Yeah.
MS-13 attacked a bus full of people, just ordinary civilians, and they killed 28 of them.
It was a massacre.
It was a blatant show of force, pure brutality.
Yeah.
It really shook the country to its core.
Right.
And it forced the government to take some kind of action.
Okay, so what do?
They implemented this policy called mano dura.
Mano dura.
Yeah, which means iron fist.
Right.
Basically a crackdown, mass arrests, trying to put a stop to the gangs.
But as you mentioned, these harsh measures didn't really work in the long run.
No, they didn't.
Why not?
Well, for one thing, you had prisons becoming even more overcrowded,
Right.
which actually ended up being a breeding ground for even more criminal activity.
Right, like a school for criminals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of concerns about human rights violations,
Right.
with these heavy-handed tactics.
Yeah.
And the gangs, they were resilient.
Right.
They adapted, went underground, became more sophisticated.
So even though it seemed like things were getting better on the surface,
Right.
the problem was still festering.
Exactly. It was a temporary fix at best.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about Venezuela
Okay.
and the rise of these so-called mega gangs.
Right.
Tren de Aragua is a name we're hearing more and more these days.
Yeah, they're becoming a major force.
How are they different from the gangs we've been talking about in Honduras?
Well, Tren de Aragua is kind of a case study in how a criminal organization can evolve and become something truly formidable. They started as a prison gang,
Right.
but they've transformed into something much bigger, more like a criminal empire.
An empire.
Yeah, with their hands in all sorts of illegal activities,
Right.
drug trafficking, of course, especially cocaine,
Right.
but also human trafficking, exploiting migrants, kidnapping, extortion, and even cybercrime and financial scams.
Wow, so they're not just thugs on the street.
No, they're much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah.
They're organized, they're well-funded, and they have connections in high places.
You also mentioned that they operate almost like a paramilitary force.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, unlike typical street gangs, Tren de Aragua is heavily armed,
Okay.
sometimes with weapons that are as good as what the government has.
Wow.
And they've built up these relationships with corrupt officials,
Right.
which gives them a level of protection and influence that's really scary.
So they're almost a state within a state?
In some ways, yes.
So how did a prison gang in Venezuela turn into this kind of powerhouse?
Well, the economic collapse in Venezuela under Maduro played a huge role.
Okay.
You had hyperinflation, widespread poverty, people were desperate.
Right.
And that made them easy prey for recruitment by gangs like Tren de Aragua, who could offer them some way to make money.
Yeah. Like a vicious cycle.
It is.
Poverty and crime.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you had the Venezuelan government failing to provide basic services.
Right.
Law enforcement was weak, corrupt.
Right.
So there was a power vacuum.
And Tren de Aragua stepped right in.
They did, and they took advantage of the situation.
Yeah.
And what's even more disturbing is that the prisons themselves became operational centers for the gangs.
So the prisons were actually helping them grow.
In a way.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
It is, but that's the reality in Venezuela.
Okay, so we've talked about MS-13 in Honduras and Tren de Aragua in Venezuela.
Right.
But these gangs are not just staying within their own countries.
No, they're not.
Their reach is extending far beyond their borders.
So this is not just a local problem anymore.
No, it's a global issue.
Can you talk a little bit about their international operations?
Yeah, so MS-13, as we've discussed, they have a presence in the U.S., Mexico, even Spain.
Right.
And Tren de Aragua, they've been expanding rapidly throughout South America.
Okay.
They're in Colombia, Peru, Chile. And there's growing evidence that they're starting to operate in the U.S. as well.
And what are they doing in these other countries?
They're involved in all sorts of criminal activities.
Okay.
Drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering.
So they're basically transnational criminal enterprises.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. So governments in the region have obviously been trying to fight back against these gangs.
Right.
We've already talked about Honduras's mano dura policies.
Yeah.
What have been the long-term consequences of those kinds of approaches?
Well, as we said, mano dura did result in a lot of arrests,
Right.
but it also led to overcrowded prisons, which actually made the problem worse in some ways.
Right. It's counterproductive.
It is. And there were serious human rights abuses.
Right.
And in the end, the gangs just adapted. They
Yeah.
found ways to continue operating.
So it was a short-term solution that didn't address the root causes.
Exactly.
And what about Venezuela?
Venezuela is a much tougher situation.
Okay.
You've got the government failing to address the issue.
Right.
And there's strong evidence that some elements within the government are actually colluding with gangs like Tren de Aragua.
That's incredible.
It is, but it's the reality there.
So it's almost like the government is enabling them.
In some ways, yes.
Wow. That's disturbing.
It is, and it makes it very difficult to combat these gangs.
Okay, so let's talk about the human cost of all of this.
Right?
What is it like for ordinary people living in communities controlled by these gangs?
It's a nightmare.
Yeah,
Extortion is rampant. They call them vacunas or war taxes.
vortexes.
Yeah, businesses and even individuals have to pay up or face the consequences.
Which are?
Violence, intimidation, even death. And then there's forced recruitment. They force kids, some as young as 12, to join their ranks.
That's just horrifying.
It is.
And of course, all this violence and instability leads to mass displacement. People are fleeing their homes,
Or they have no choice.
and women are particularly vulnerable.
Yes, they're at high risk of being trafficked or forced into prostitution.
It's a truly horrific situation.
It is. There's no other way to describe it.
So the big question is, can these gangs be stopped?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Experts say it requires a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means tackling the root causes.
Okay,
Poverty, lack of opportunity, corruption.
right,
You need economic development to give people alternatives.
right.
You need to reform the police and the judicial system to make them more effective and less corrupt.
All right.
You need international cooperation to disrupt these transnational criminal networks.
Right.
And you need community-based programs to help at-risk youth.
So it's the long-term complex solution.
It is. There's no quick fix for this.
So we've learned a lot today
We have.
about the rise of these powerful and dangerous gangs in Honduras and Venezuela,
Right.
and how they've become a regional crisis with global implications.
Exactly.
MS-13 with its roots in the U.S. and Tren de Aragua in Venezuela.
Right.
They're not just local gangs anymore. They're sophisticated criminal enterprises involved in drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering.
And they're expanding their reach all the time.
And despite efforts to combat them,
Right.
they continue to grow and adapt.
Yeah, it's a very worrying trend.
It is, and it makes you wonder
Yeah.
what's going to happen if we don't address the root causes of this problem.
Right. The poverty, the corruption, the weak institutions.
Yeah, exactly.
If those things don't change,
Right.
this problem is just going to keep getting worse.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought.
It is.
So, listeners, I'll leave you with this.
Okay.
Think about what the future holds for Honduras, Venezuela, and the entire region if we don't find a way to tackle these underlying issues.
Yeah. It's a challenge we all need to be thinking about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.